Genesis chapter 12 tonight. And yes, I believe we would probably cover the entire chapter. By the way, beginning at this point, we're kind of through the early part of Genesis that tends to take a while. The remainder of the book of Genesis is largely a history of the origins of Israel. We're going to see a lot in here about, of course, Abraham and how God worked through Abraham to bring about the Jewish people. And so, not to say there isn't theology in this, the next 38 chapters of the book of Genesis are pretty much going to be more historical. And so it's not a matter of just sitting and taking a verse and saying, okay, what did this really mean? What is the Hebrew talking about? What might have happened? So much as it's going to be, what did God do with his people? And how does this relate to us? What's the lesson we get out of it? So we will probably, for the remainder of the book of Genesis, tend to move a good bit quicker than we did earlier. All right, chapter 12, beginning in verse 1. It says, "Now the Lord said to Abram," now right off the bat, you'll notice that Abraham is not Abraham yet. Still going by his birth name of Abram. "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Now, that right there in a nutshell is what theologians refer to as the Abrahamic Covenant. This is God's covenant with Abraham, that it would be through him that the Messiah would come. Now, there are two types of covenants in the Bible. The one first, probably most common type of covenant, is God's promise that if you do this, I'll do this over here. For example, his covenant with the Israelites, which is the Palestinian covenant, is that as long as you remain faithful to me, I'll bless you. If you don't, then I'm going to have to punish you. You notice that kind of covenant is a conditional covenant. It's a, if you do this, I'll do that. The second type of covenant, which is what this is an unconditional covenant. You'll notice God doesn't say, Abraham, you need to do this, and then I'll do this over here. God just lays it out and says, Abraham, here's my promise to you. Period. Now, it was expected that Abraham would respond in faith and do what God told him, but as God presented it to Abraham, there was no condition on it. God said, Abram, I'm going to bless you.
It's a done deal.
It's a done deal. It required nothing on Abram's part. Now again, Abram did respond in faith, but as the covenant is presented, it was a one-way, unconditional covenant. It's all on God.
And this is still a valid covenant.
It is still a valid covenant, which we're going to get to here in just a moment. Notice, it says, first off, go forth from your country. Well, where were they living at the time?
Haran.
In Haran. They'd moved as far as Haran, which is in the upper Euphrates River Valley. I think at one point I might have said Tigris. Actually, I was right the first time. It's in the Euphrates Valley, because the Tigris is the one that's farther to the east.
That'd be like northern Lebanon?
Not new, way farther than that, like northern Iraq.
Okay.
He's in he and his family were living in the upper valley of the Euphrates River. Now we see from chapter 11 that his dad has just died. Now his dad, with Abram in tow and Lot and any of the rest of the family they would have taken along with them that probably were at this point unnamed. Haran is Terah is the family patriarch. And it was customary at that point that as long as the family patriarch was alive, the rest of the family did what he claimed, what he said, and went where he went. God has waited until Terah has died, and that now makes Abram the family patriarch. And at this point, with him as the patriarch, now God steps in. And again, we have no way of knowing if God has spoken to Terah or Abram already. It just doesn't tell us. But we do know that at this point, God has stepped in and called Abram and said, I've got a promise for you. He said, go forth from your country. Now, whether God was talking about Ur, where they had originally originated, or whether it's Haran, doesn't matter. It said, however Abram wanted to interpret it, he's got to leave. It says, from your relatives and from your father's house. So at this point, he's being told, leave the rest of your relatives behind. To the land which I will show you. Now, even though under Terah's leadership, they had already planned to go to Canaan, the fact that God says, I'm going to take you to a land which I will show you, what does that tell us at this point?
It's not Canaan.
Well, no, actually it was Canaan, because that's exactly where God led them. But what it tells us is even though they may have been intending to go to Canaan, he'd never been there before. They didn't have a clue. What's that? Well, yep. If you're looking at a map, yeah, it's definitely going the long way around. But there's another reason for it as well. Because if you go south in the Euphrates River Valley, and then left the Euphrates River Valley, headed west, or directly into or from the Euphrates River Valley toward Palestine, or at this point Canaan, what would have happened?
Run into the mountains.
Desert.
All desert.
Absolutely lifeless desert.
Aren't there mountains in northern Lebanon?
They just followed the Euphrates.
Yeah, but they probably wouldn't have crossed those
They go
mountains.
around those. Okay.
They would have gone through the desert area,
All right, I'm a little confused, and I haven't read ahead enough to be unconfused, but the heading for this chapter in my Bible says Abram journeys to Egypt, not to Canaan.
well, if you're coming from the upper Euphrates River Valley and you're headed to Egypt, guess what you got to go through first? Canaan. Ultimately, they get to Egypt, but it's not yet.
Okay.
Abram didn't know he was going to end up in Egypt at this point. God's called him to go to Canaan first. So it says, to the land which I will show you, which tells us that one of two things, which I think maybe a little bit of both. Abram had never been to Canaan and didn't know where Canaan was. He was just basically following Terah's leadership. Or, even though they ended up in Canaan, God may have just told him, it's like, well, go where I want you to go, and I'll tell you when you get there. I had a friend of mine that Connie knows exactly who I'm talking about here. He was a pastor in the Thomasville area. I don't know how many times the other pastors, we used to meet once a week at the association office and just sit around and swap war stories and complain about, everything. Pastors burn off steam too. But we'd sit around and he would gripe just about every week about how rough his church was, and he just wanted to move on, but God won't let him move on, and said, I've prayed that God would send me to another church. This church that I've been pastoring for so long now is just driving me nuts, and blah, blah, blah. Well, the point is the guy was actually from the Thomasville area. He lived in just the next town up, just across the county line, and he and his wife had decided that he wanted to pastor another church, but by George, he was going to stay in that area. And all of us told him, if you want God to bless you, you're going to have to be willing to go anywhere. It may be that if you get on your knees and surrender to God and say, Lord, wherever you want me to go, I'll go. God may turn out and provide you with a church right down the street. But you won't know that until you're at least willing to go anywhere. As long as you keep putting conditions on it and telling God you want another church, but you're only willing to stay in this area, guess what? You ain't going nowhere. And he several times said, yeah, I know that, but. It was always, I know that, but. We told him,
I don't want to surrender.
Exactly. We told him, he said, guess what?
Will. Yep.
And by the way, I looked this guy up a month or two ago. Guess what? He's still at that same church. He's probably been there for nearly 20 years now because he will not leave the area. And we told him, said, until you're willing to pull up stakes and go where God sends you, you know, God may send you down the street, but God don't make deals. Well, I'm saying that's for this reason. That may have been the situation with Abram. It may have been that they decided to go to Canaan, and God actually intended him to go to Canaan, but God had to put Abram in a spot where Abram was willing to go wherever, not knowing what the destination was until he got there and God said, oh, by the way, you're there. I mean, we don't know, but I suspect he'd never been to Canaan before. Because, I mean, let's face it, from going the long way up the Euphrates River Valley, you know, we've all studied the so-called Fertile Crescent in social studies when we were in middle school. You know, all up along that area through that valley and down the Mediterranean coast is a very fertile area. But when you go east of there out into Arabia, guess what? Nobody goes out there unless you got a lot of supplies, because that's no man's land. There's no water out there, and you only go out there to die. So it may have been that, you know, that's the direction they were going, but my point is that in order to get there back then, when the only way you could go anywhere was on foot or by camel, it would have been a journey of several months and close to 1,000 miles. You don't take off on a 1,000-mile journey back then without a lot of supplies, and the likelihood based on that Abram had ever been to Canaan before, probably very slim. Very slim. So that's item number one. God is sending him to a new land. Verse 2, now we get into the part that's interesting. At this point, how many kids did Abram have? None. And he and his wife both were beginning to get elderly. Says, I'm going to make you a great nation. Well, right off the bat, that tells him that, okay, something's got to change here. If I'm going to have a lot of descendants to the point that, God's going to make a whole nation out of my descendants, I got to have some kids first. He didn't have any at this point. Says, I will bless you. Well, back then, of course, God's blessings in many cases were evaluated one of two ways. How much cattle and belongings did you have, and how many kids did you have? He was by this point beginning to assimilate a lot of livestock, although he was nowhere near the rich man that he would be, say, 10 years after this passage was, the time frame of this passage. And he definitely didn't have any kids. And make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. Which means now he's saying not only is God going to bless Abram, but Abram is now going to be a blessing to other people. Now, of course, I have no doubt at this point, Abram had no idea how that was going to take place. But of course, we know, how did Abram, or later Abraham, become a blessing to other people?
Through Jesus Christ.
He was the ancestor of Jesus, absolutely. This was God's indirect way of telling Abram that the Messiah, the promised line, would come through him. Now, verse 3, that's the part that's particularly applicable to life today. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. Now, of course, Abram has been dead and gone for, 3,000 years. So clearly, if we're talking about future events, we're talking about his descendants. And what, if anybody, is probably the most hated people in the world today?
Children of
Jews,
Abraham.
the children of Abraham. And in fact, it's the big argument between the descendants of Ishmael and the descendants of Isaac that's causing 2/3 of the conflicts in the world today, which Abraham kind of brought that on himself between, by kind of having a stumbling block in his faith with God.
Wasn't he talked into that by a woman?
I believe he was.
Don't go there, Meryl. I did.
You can afford to do that because you don't have one to go home to. Just a bunch of cats.
No, but he has a bunch of adopted sisters that could beat him before he got out there.
You gotta get a ride with one of them.
Short walk.
What's that?
It's a short walk.
No, it ain't.
Not from here.
Not for a man my age.
Anyway, so yeah, right now you wonder how is so many people and other nations in the world that want to see the Jews dead, but if you fast forward to let's see, Book of Revelation talks about it, Joel talks about it, I believe Zechariah talks about it, and I could go on and on about other prophetic books, that the one thing that every single one of them has in common about the millennial kingdom is that what we see going on in the world now, where the Jews are the hated people and everybody wants to wipe them off the face of the earth, we see that completely reversed, where in the millennial kingdom the world will be going to Jerusalem to seek the help of the Jews and blessing them. And if you want to be blessed, if your country even wants to have rain during the year, the Bible tells us you got to go to Jerusalem to worship, or God won't even send any rain on your nation the following year. So that whole situation is going to be reversed. But before that happens, the Jews are going to get, they're going to undergo persecution. God's going to weed them out.
And even over the course of history past, look at what has happened to each of the nations or empires that sought to persecute the Jews. For a while they succeeded, but in the long run, each one of those countries and nations has disappeared from the earth.
They're still around.
Yep.
Of course,
Mac?
based on your knowledge, and just throwing this question out to other people too, the Jews have been hated since day one. They've been hated by all countries for some reason. The question is, what is that reason?
I can give you one big reason right now. Who is the God of this world?
Satan.
Satan is. And who are God's people? So who by definition and extension does Satan probably hate the most? There's two groups of people in this world that Satan despises: Christians and the Jews, because we're God's people. And you figure one of the reasons that God will be able to fulfill this promise that God's people will be loved and sought after during the millennial kingdom is who gets locked up for 1,000 years during that period of time. Satan does. Satan is no longer in control at that point. But look in our recent history. Hitler regime is a good example. By the way, the 6 million Jews that the Nazis are credited with killing, they ain't the only people they killed. They killed a whole lot more than 6 million.
Oh yeah.
A lot more. But for our purposes tonight, we want to focus on these 6 million Jews. I think two things happened there. Number one, I think God used the Third Reich, in the same way that he used Babylon. God used the Babylonian invasion to punish Israel and to bring Israel to repentance. But what happened afterward? The Babylonians got defeated. I think that with the World War II, God was starting a process. Now, is it done yet? No. But I think God was starting a process that, number one, would result in the reuniting of God's people in their land. Because what caused the nation of today's nation of Israel to come to fruition?
Basically, the country.
The Holocaust.
Well, not just the Holocaust, but after the war was over with, the British Mandate, they figured, we can't let something like this happen again. The Holocaust being that, we can't let this happen again. These people need their land back.
They got the land back.
Yeah, and it was because of that God began the process of bringing them back to Israel. But he punished many of them for their disobedience and their disbelief. But then, just like Babylon, what happened to Hitler and the Third Reich, when it was over with?
Vanquished.
Oh, they don't exist anymore. Now, the German people still exist, but God put a stop to that.
The Roman Empire doesn't exist anymore.
No.
All of those who ended up, succeeding in persecuting them for a time have disappeared.
Now, on the other hand, if you get into a discussion with somebody about how do we know that God really exists and what is one of the biggest evidences that God does exist, I believe the Jewish people themselves are strong evidence that God exists. Because how many times have we seen in world history that people, entire empires have gone out of their way to try to extinguish the Jews, and yet they're still here.
And the miracle of Israel back, Hebrew-speaking country.
Mhm.
Another one.
No matter how hard that the world tries to stomp them out, they keep coming back.
There's another one. How many different religions are there? There's over 800 different types of religions, and the only religion that anybody wants to persecute is the Christians.
That's a pretty good point.
Well, not just the Christians, Judaism too.
Yeah.
Yes, but that's in there. What?
I was going to save
Because
this
they,
till after.
God,
I was going to save this till afterward, but it seems to dovetail into what we're talking about right now. But this afternoon, I watched a short little video on YouTube by a guy who was presenting the concept that Alexander the Great was an instrument of God. That the prophecy that the Messiah would come in the fullness of time, and he went to talk about what does the fullness of time mean, and he pointed out that Alexander's 10-year conquest of the entire Middle East and the spreading of a common language, he said that was the first time that there was a common language across that entire region since the Tower of Babel, and that having that common language was one of the requirements of being able to spread the gospel to everyone in the region. And that Alexander the Great, having done that, was part of God's plan to bring about that fullness of time.
And on a similar note, that may be one of the reasons why God has allowed this country to prosper as much as it has, because what's today's common language? English. And up until recently, what was the one country that sent more missionaries, to spread the gospel than any other? In fact, many other countries combined, United States, up until recently. And I think our failure to keep up with that, and this is the last point I was going to make on this passage of Scripture, when this country stops blessing Israel and staying on the side of Israel will be when we see God judge us. I believe that's one of the biggest things that is keeping God's judgment back on this country, is the fact that this country still stands with Israel. When the day comes that we back off from Israel and wash our hands of the Jewish people, will be the day that this country falls.
abortion and everything else, and that's the only thing we do right. You're right. I don't think we do anything else right.
We were teetering with Biden and
Trying to get rid of
not
that.
backing Israel.
Yep. And we see what happened with that.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I clearly did not get anywhere near as far in this passage of Scripture as I thought I was going to.
We sidetracked you good.
Apparently. All right. Well, we'll pick up with verse 4 on Wednesday. So.
That was good.
It all started with a dipstick.
All started with a dipstick.
You're talking about the
My
stem of
fault.
a person.
I'm guilty.
What's that?
The stem of a person.
Yeah, I figured it was an understood.
Who's the dipstick now?